The moment I turned off the water valve, I knew hell was coming. But nothing prepared me for the police lights flashing at my gate. Arrest him. He's stealing our water, screamed the HOA president, her manicured finger jabbing through the dusk. What she didn't know, this wasn't just about water, it was about exposing a decade of lies. By sunrise, her empire of intimidation would crumble, and I had the evidence to prove it. She's trying to have me arrested on my own land. The police cruiser's lights flashed against my barn as I stood in disbelief, mud-caked hands still gripping the water valve. Just 3 days into living on my new ranch, a place I had imagined would be my own peaceful heaven. And here I was, facing potential arrest. At my gate, Deborah Harrington, the self-proclaimed HOA queen, jabbed her manicured finger toward me, her face contorted with rage as she screamed, "Handcuff him now. He's stealing our water." Her eyes locked on mine, wild and unblinking. In that moment, I wasn't a neighbor, I was prey. And she'd just decided I deserved to bleed. Little did this entitled tyrant know, her empire of intimidation was about to come crashing down. This wasn't just about water. It was standing up to bullies who think money puts them above the law. Where are you watching from? Drop your state in the comments. I bet you've got your own HOA horror story to share. I'd saved for years to buy this 15-acre ranch in rural Texas, dreaming of a self-sufficient lifestyle away from the constant pressure of city planning meetings and endless bureaucracy. My name is Jason Cooper, and after 12 years as an urban planning engineer for the city of Austin, I was ready for change. The small creek running through the property was one of the main selling points. Natural irrigation for my future crops and perfect for the sustainable living system I designed. The day I signed those papers was the happiest of my life. The previous owner's kids sold fast, too fast. I should have wondered why a 15-acre paradise went for pennies. The elderly seller had passed away months before, and his children just wanted a quick, hassle-free sale. When I arrived with my truck full of possessions and dreams, the last thing I expected was to become embroiled in a water rights dispute with the fancy Sunnyvale Estates community bordering my land. My blood ran cold as I traced the pipeline on my second day. Someone had been stealing my water for years, and they weren't just taking it. They'd left a ticking time bomb on my land. While exploring the property's boundaries, I noticed plastic piping running from my creek to somewhere beyond my fence line. Following it led me to a small pump station, cleverly hidden among bushes about 20 foot inside what my property survey clearly showed was my land. The pipes continued under the fence toward the man-made lake at the center of Sunnyvale Estates, an upscale housing development where homes started at $700,000. Being a reasonable person with extensive knowledge of property and water rights from my previous job, I decided to handle this professionally. I called the HOA office, listed on a small sign near the community entrance, politely explaining what I'd found and requesting a meeting to discuss a solution. The secretary sounded pleasant enough, promising someone would contact me soon. Soon turned out to be less than 2 hours later when a white Lexus SUV with SUNVL1 vanity plates came roaring up my gravel driveway, dust billowing behind it like an approaching storm. A tall woman in her mid-50s emerged, designer sunglasses perched on her head, wearing what appeared to be tennis clothes despite no evidence she'd been anywhere near a court that day. "I'm Deborah Harrington, Sunnyvale Estates' HOA president," she announced without bothering with pleasantries. "We received your call about the water system." Her tone carried the unmistakable edge of someone used to getting her way without question. When I explained my concerns about the pump on my property and the water being diverted from my creek, her demeanor shifted from merely condescending to outright dismissive. "That water system has been in place for years. The previous owner never had an issue with our arrangement," she said, waving her hand as if swatting away an annoying insect. "Besides, your little farmhouse is hardly an improvement to the area. If anything, you should be thanking us for maintaining property values. Despite your presence, I maintained my composure, explaining that regardless of any past informal arrangements, the creek and pump station were legally on my property. I'm open to discussing a formal agreement, I offered. But as it stands, you're diverting water without permission, and your equipment is on my land without easement. Deborah's eyes narrowed dangerously. She stepped closer, the scent of expensive perfume momentarily overwhelming the natural farm smells I'd come to appreciate. Listen carefully, she hissed, all pretense of civility evaporating. Sunnyvale residents have certain expectations about our community aesthetics and amenities. Our lake is central to our property values. Touch that water supply and you'll regret moving here. With that, she spun on her heel, marched back to her Lexus, and sped away, leaving me standing in a cloud of dust and disbelief. Later, I'd learn about the divorce, the bankruptcies, the desperate need to make Sunnyvale perfect, but that night, all I saw was rage. That evening, I pored over my property documents, confirming what I already knew. The creek ran entirely through my property, and there were no recorded easements or water sharing agreements with Sunnyvale Estates or anyone else. While researching local regulations, I was startled by a knock at my door. My visitor was Frank Parker, a weather-beaten man in his late 50s from the neighboring farm. Saw Harrington's car earlier, he said by way of introduction. Figured you could use a beer and some local knowledge. Over bottles of Shiner Bock on my porch, Frank filled me in on the HOA and its president. Deborah's been running that place like her personal kingdom for 8 years. Used to be a mid-level executive at some big real estate firm. Got connections with half the county officials and isn't shy about using them. He took a long swig of beer. My wife and I tangled with her when they tried expanding their boundaries a few years back. Stress from that fight and their constant construction noise contributed to my wife's miscarriage. His voice grew quiet. Just watch yourself. That woman doesn't play fair. The next morning, armed with knowledge and resolve, I made my decision. If Sunnyvale wanted to use my water, they'd need a proper legal agreement and fair compensation. Until then, I had every right to control resources on my own property. I located the main valve connecting their pipe to my creek and closed it firmly. As I finished securing it with a heavy-duty lock, my security camera captured Deborah returning to stand at my gate, screaming into the camera, "You have no idea who you're dealing with," before speeding away in her Lexus like she was auditioning for an action movie. I glanced at the camera feed on my phone and couldn't help a small smile. Well, so much for a quiet life. The smile froze on my face as my phone began ringing, the screen displaying County Sheriff's Office. Mr. Cooper, this is Sheriff Thompson. We've received a complaint about vandalism of community infrastructure and interference with an established water supply on your property. The voice was professional but weary, as though this wasn't the first frivolous call he'd received. I explained my situation calmly, emphasizing that I discovered unauthorized equipment on my land, diverting my water resources. "I understand, sir," the sheriff replied. "Unfortunately, I'm required to investigate any formal complaint. I'll be at your property in about 20 minutes if that's convenient." I agreed readily, confident in my legal position, but appreciative of the sheriff's respectful approach. While waiting, I gathered my property documents, surveys, and water rights information. Preparation that would prove invaluable sooner than I expected. Sheriff Thompson arrived in his patrol car, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, and the cautious demeanor of someone who'd seen it all. Before we could even exchange proper greetings, the now familiar white Lexus came tearing up my driveway, followed by two other vehicles bearing Sunnyvale Estates parking stickers. Deborah emerged like a general leading troops into battle, accompanied by two men in polo shirts emblazoned with the Sunnyvale logo. Without waiting for permission, they marched onto my property as if they owned it. "Sheriff, I'm glad you're here to witness this," Deborah announced loudly. "This man has deliberately sabotaged critical community infrastructure and is causing ecological damage to our lake habitat." A fourth vehicle pulled up, a county-marked SUV from which emerged a balding man in his 60s with an official-looking clipboard. Greg Sullivan, County Water Resources Manager, Deborah announced with obvious satisfaction. He'll explain the regulations this farmer is violating. Sullivan approached with the confidence of someone used to wielding authority. Mr. Cooper, I understand you've interfered with an established watercourse. Under riparian customary rights, when a water source has been consistently used by a community for multiple years, it becomes a customary usage right regardless of property boundaries. His tone was instructional, as though explaining basic concepts to a child. I kept my expression neutral, though internally I was both amused and appalled by this creative interpretation of water law. Actually, Mr. Sullivan, I responded, retrieving my folder of documents. Riparian customary rights only apply when there's initial permission or agreement from the landowner. He cited laws older than Texas, laws that let thieves call themselves kings, if you let them. There's no recorded easement or water sharing agreement in my property title. Furthermore, Texas water law specifically protects the rights of property owners to water resources originating on or flowing through their land, particularly in agricultural contexts. The exchange continued with increasing tension, my urban planning background proving unexpectedly valuable in this rural dispute. Sullivan's confident expression gradually faltered as I countered each of his points with specific legal citations. Deborah, seeing her expert being outmatched, suddenly pushed past me toward the creek area. I'm going to open that valve myself. This is ridiculous. Her voice had reached a pitch that probably disturbed wildlife for miles around. When I stepped in front of her to block access to my property, she recoiled dramatically. He assaulted me, she shrieked, though I hadn't touched her. Sheriff Williams, arrest this man immediately. Sheriff Thompson's eyebrows shot up at both the accusation and the incorrect name. Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Thompson, and I witnessed the entire interaction. Mr. Cooper did not touch you. Deborah wasn't listening. To everyone's astonishment, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911, despite the sheriff standing right there. I need to report an assault at the old Anderson property. Send officers immediately to arrest Jason Cooper. Sheriff Thompson's face darkened as he stepped closer to Deborah. Ma'am, this is obstruction of law enforcement. You want to go there? He asked quietly, his patience clearly wearing thin. Deborah ignored him, continuing her theatrical performance for the emergency dispatcher. Meanwhile, Sullivan received a text message that seemed to change his entire demeanor. After a quick glance at Deborah, he cleared his throat. Perhaps there's an administrative solution here, he suggested, his tone suddenly conciliatory. Mr. Cooper, we could investigate potential zoning violations regarding agricultural use requirements. That might give us all time to resolve this water issue more cooperatively. The threat was thinly veiled, but clear. Back down on the water issue or face bureaucratic harassment on other fronts. Sheriff Thompson, to his credit, had enough. This is clearly a civil dispute about property boundaries and water rights, he announced firmly. Miss Harrington, I'm asking you and your associates to leave Mr. Cooper's property immediately, or you will be trespassing. That's something I can take action on right now. Deborah finally ended her 911 call, shooting me a venomous glare. This isn't over. The HOA bylaws protect our community assets, and we will take every legal action available. Sullivan added his own warning about sending inspectors to check compliance with agricultural land use requirements. As they finally departed in their caravan of expensive vehicles, I thanked Sheriff Thompson for his professionalism. Not my first rodeo with Sunnyvale complaints, he admitted with a tired smile. Just document everything, Mr. Cooper. Everything. But as his taillights vanished, my security alert blared. Deborah wasn't done. She'd brought reinforcements, and they weren't here to talk. After he left, I did a careful walk of my property boundary with Sunnyvale. That's when I discovered someone had moved a boundary stake about 15 feet into my property, recently enough that the disturbed soil was still visible. This wasn't just irrigation, it was a lifeline. But not for crops. For the $20 million secret buried under Sunnyvale's fake lake. This wasn't just about water anymore. It was a systematic encroachment. Back at my house, I found an email waiting in my inbox from Sunnyvale Estates legal counsel with the subject line, Notice of Legal Violation and Urgent Demand. The legal notice was as aggressive as it was baseless, demanding I restore water flow within 24 hours or face legal action for violating historical irrigation rights and causing imminent harm to established community ecosystems. It cited obscure precedents and regulations that, upon quick research, were either inapplicable or misrepresented. The letter concluded with a thinly veiled threat about pursuing all available remedies, including financial damages and injunctive relief. I forwarded it to my own attorney with a request for guidance, then headed to Frank Parker's farm for advice from someone who understood the local dynamics. I forwarded it to my lawyer and discovered Sunnyvale's secret. They hadn't just wanted my water. They needed my land to bury their lies. Over coffee at his kitchen table, Frank examined the email and shook his head. Classic Sunnyvale intimidation. They tried the same legal gibberish with the Hendersons last year over a disputed drainage ditch. He thought for a moment, then added, Amanda Harrington, Deborah's daughter, might actually be helpful. She's a lawyer, but nothing like her mother. Word is she's embarrassed by how Deborah runs the HOA. While reviewing property records at the county clerk's office, I discovered something interesting. Sunnyvale Estates had attempted to purchase my property multiple times over the past 5 years, each time with increasingly generous offers that the previous owner had flatly refused. The most recent attempt had been just 2 months before his death. This suggested a longer-term interest in my land beyond mere water access. I managed to connect with Amanda Harrington through a professional networking site, carefully explaining my situation without disparaging her mother. To my surprise, she agreed to meet at a coffee shop halfway between Sunnyvale and my ranch. Amanda proved to be thoughtful and professional, nothing like Deborah's imperious manner. I've tried to get the board to approach these issues differently, she confided after hearing my side. There are legitimate ways to negotiate water sharing that benefit everyone, but Mom tends to, well, bulldoze. She winced at her own word choice. I can't officially help you against Sunnyvale, but I can tell you they're on shaky legal ground, especially without pump placement. While I was meeting with Amanda, Deborah was conducting an emergency HOA meeting about the water crisis. A community member tipped off Rachel Turner, a local reporter known for her investigative work and growing social media presence. Rachel managed to slip into the meeting room before anyone realized she wasn't a resident. Deborah stood at a podium dramatically describing how the eccentric living in that barn, referring to my renovated farmhouse, was stealing drinking water from the entire community. She displayed photos of the lake with deliberately misleading before and after shots suggesting it was rapidly draining, though the water level had barely changed in the day since I'd closed the valve. When Amanda arrived late and heard her mother's characterization, she attempted to interject with facts about the actual water situation, but Deborah sharply cut her off. Not now, Amanda. The adults are handling this. Rachel's live updates of the meeting were quickly gaining attention online, particularly when she captured Deborah's dismissive treatment of her own daughter. Frank texted me a link to Rachel's live coverage, and I watched in disbelief as Deborah spun an elaborate fiction about my actions and intentions. This isn't just about water, she told the assembled residents. It's about preserving our way of life and property values against those who don't respect our community's standards. I decided to go there myself, armed with my documentation and survey results. When I arrived at the Sunnyvale Community Center, a security guard blocked my entrance. HA meetings are for residents only, he informed me gruffly. Rachel Turner spotted me outside and immediately approached with her camera. Jason Cooper, the rancher at the center of today's water dispute, She began professionally. What's your response to claims you're endangering the Sunnyvale Lake ecosystem? I calmly explained the actual situation, showing her my property documents and photos of the unauthorized pump on my land. I'm not opposed to a proper water sharing agreement, I emphasized. But it needs to be legal, fair, and formally documented, not taken without permission. Rachel's interview was generating significant interest, with her followers commenting and sharing rapidly. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to me, Deborah had dispatched two HOA maintenance workers to my property with instructions to repair the water system, meaning remove my lock and reopen the valve. My phone buzzed with a security alert showing unknown individuals at my creekside fence. I excused myself from the interview and drove home as quickly and legally as possible. Arriving at my property, I found two men in Sunnyvale maintenance uniforms attempting to cut through my heavy-duty lock with bolt cutters. I immediately began recording video evidence as I approached them. "Excuse me, you're trespassing on private property," I called out firmly. "I need you to leave immediately." The older of the two men turned with surprising arrogance. "We have authorization from the County Water Authority to maintain this infrastructure," he claimed, waving vaguely toward his truck parked on the road. Mr. Sullivan said this is essential maintenance of a public water system. I continued recording as I explained they were mistaken. There was no public water system on my private property, and Greg Sullivan had no authority to authorize their trespass. They refused to leave, one of them continuing to work on my lock while the other tried to block my camera view. Fortunately, Sheriff Thompson arrived minutes later, responding to my urgent call. Seeing the situation, he immediately ordered the men to step away from my property. "Unless you have a court order or a written easement, you cannot enter this property or tamper with private infrastructure," he informed them with unmistakable authority. "This goes beyond a simple dispute. Now you're engaged in criminal trespass and attempted destruction of private property." The maintenance workers finally backed down, though not without muttering threats about hearing from our lawyers. After they departed, Sheriff Thompson advised me to install more security cameras and keep documenting everything. As he was leaving, I discovered a notice taped to my gate. A county building inspector would be visiting tomorrow to investigate reported unpermitted construction violations on my ranch. Would they burn my barn next? Poison the creek? One thing was clear. This wasn't a property dispute anymore. This was war. The building inspector arrived precisely at 9 the next morning, clipboard in hand and with the mechanical demeanor of someone following a predetermined script. His name badge identified him as Robert Martinez, but his stiff formality and refusal to make eye contact suggested he'd received specific instructions, likely from Greg Sullivan, to find problems regardless of reality. I maintained a polite, cooperative attitude as I showed him around my property, providing copies of all permits and approvals I'd obtained for the minor renovations I'd completed. The previous owner kept meticulous records, I explained, showing documentation for the barn conversion and updated electrical work. And I've filed all the proper paperwork for my planned agricultural improvements. Martinez said little, methodically checking items off his list while occasionally taking photos and making notes with robotic precision. Despite my thorough documentation, he identified several minor potential violations, all suspiciously located near the boundary with Sunnyvale Estates. "Your chicken coop appears to be 8 inches too close to the property line," Martinez stated flatly, measuring the distance to the recently moved boundary stake I discovered earlier. "And this storage shed exceeds the allowable height for structures within 50 feet of a residential zone." I pointed out that according to my official survey, both structures were well within compliance if the original boundary markers were used. Martinez merely made another note without comment. "I'll be filing my report with the county office. You will receive official notification of any violations within 5 business days." As he drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling I was facing a coordinated campaign from multiple angles. That afternoon, I called a professional surveying company to formally document my property boundaries, paying extra for an expedited service that could begin the following day. While waiting, I installed additional security cameras focused on the boundary areas and creek, activating motion alerts on my phone. The next morning, a certified letter arrived from Sunnyvale Estates' HO listing fines for the alleged building code violations and threatening escalating penalties if I didn't cooperate regarding community water access. The letter also mentioned potential daily fines for aesthetic violations visible from community property, though my ranch wasn't even visible from most of Sunnyvale due to the natural tree line separating our properties. I was beginning to understand Frank's warnings about Deborah's tactics. The surveying team arrived shortly after, and I explained the situation, showing them both the original survey and the suspiciously relocated boundary stakes. Unfortunately, this happens more often than you'd think, the lead surveyor commented, especially when large developments border individual properties. Let's establish the correct boundaries once and for all. By afternoon, the results confirmed my suspicions. Sunnyvale Estates had systematically encroached approximately 20 feet into my property along most of the shared boundary, not just at the creek area. The encroachment had likely happened gradually over several years, moving markers bit by bit to avoid obvious detection. This wasn't opportunistic water theft. It was a calculated land grab. The surveying company provided official documentation, including GPS coordinates and comparison with county records, proving the correct boundary lines. Armed with this evidence, I installed a series of cameras along the proper boundary line, especially focusing on the disputed creek area and the unauthorized pump. That evening, Deborah arrived with several HOA board members, demanding I remove the cameras immediately. Those surveillance devices are aimed at community property and invading our residents' privacy, she insisted, her voice carrying across my yard. Actually, Miss Harrington, these cameras are aimed exclusively at my property. The property your association has been gradually encroaching upon, I replied calmly, showing her the survey results. If your residents happen to be trespassing on my land, that's not a privacy issue. That's a trespassing issue. One of the board members, an older gentleman who appeared uncomfortable with the confrontation, tried to suggest a compromise. Perhaps we could discuss a formal easement for the water access, with proper compensation, of course. Before he could continue, Deborah cut him off sharply. We don't need easements for historical usage rights. Edward, don't undermine our position. The group eventually left with threats of legal escalation, but I noticed the older board member lingering, looking like he wanted to say more before Deborah called him back to her car. That night, my newly installed cameras captured remarkable footage. Deborah and Greg Sullivan meeting at the boundary line around midnight, the rain falling lightly around them. Car headlights casting eerie shadows across the wet grass as they deliberately moved another boundary stake deeper into my property. The next morning, I discovered they had also placed water monitoring devices on my side of the creek, a significant escalation of their invasive tactics. I carefully documented everything without disturbing their illegal placements, building my case methodically. Rachel Turner contacted me that afternoon, interested in doing an in-depth story about the dispute. There's something off about this whole situation, she explained during our phone conversation. HOAs can be aggressive about rules enforcement, but this level of boundary manipulation and resource appropriation goes beyond typical community disputes. I agreed to an interview, sharing select evidence including the unauthorized pump installation and the survey results showing the boundary encroachment. Rachel also collected water samples from both upstream and downstream of the diversion point. I'm having these analyzed by an independent lab, she explained, just in case the HOA tries something else. With disputes like this, it's good to have baseline water quality documentation. Meanwhile, Sunnyvale Estates organized a counteroffensive press conference where Deborah portrayed herself as an environmental champion. The selfish actions of one individual should not be allowed to destroy a delicate ecosystem that hundreds of families enjoy, she told the assembled local media. Our lake supports various wildlife and is central to our community's environmental commitments. She strategically had children playing near the lake in the background during her statement, creating a visual narrative of innocent families versus a single troublemaker. As I watched the coverage online, a legal notice arrived in my email. Sunnyvale Estates HOA had filed a lawsuit against me for willful damage to community property, with estimated damages of $500,000, their claimed cost to replace the lake ecosystem if it dried up. The legal papers demanded an emergency injunction, forcing me to reopen the water valve immediately, with a hearing scheduled for the following week. I consulted with my attorney immediately about the lawsuit, forwarding all documentation of the boundary encroachment and unauthorized water diversion. They're overreaching significantly, she assured me after reviewing the materials. In fact, you have solid grounds for a countersuit for trespassing, unauthorized use of resources, and possibly even fraudulent boundary manipulation. She recommended we file a countersuit immediately while preparing for the injunction hearing. The legal costs were concerning. Sunnyvale clearly had deeper pockets than I did as a single ranch owner, but I couldn't back down now. This wasn't just about water anymore. It was about standing up to systematic bullying and land theft. That evening, I received a surprising text message from Amanda Harrington asking to meet again. I found some information you should know. Her message read, "This situation is worse than I realized. We met at the same coffee shop as before, Amanda looking noticeably stressed. I can't be directly involved in your case against the HOA, she began, speaking quietly despite the relatively empty cafe. But I've discovered something troubling while reviewing old HOA documents. She explained that she'd found preliminary contracts between Sunnyvale Estates and a golf resort development company dating back 3 years. The plans involved expanding the community amenities to include an upscale golf course directly on the land where my ranch now stood. Mom promised the developers she could acquire that land. They've already invested in preliminary designs and environmental studies based on her assurances. Amanda showed me a copy of a preliminary agreement with the developer logo clearly visible. When the previous owner refused to sell, they began the boundary encroachment as a pressure tactic, thinking his heirs would be more willing to sell after his death. Then you bought it before they could approach the family. Rachel Turner's story about our dispute went live the next morning, titled Water Wars in Rural Texas, when HOAs overstepped their boundaries. The article presented both sides, but included the damning survey evidence and photos of the unauthorized pump on my property. Her social media posts about the story gained significant traction, particularly a short video clip where I stood at the incorrectly placed boundary stake, explaining, "They think country folks don't know the law, but I used to write planning policies for these developments." The video accumulated over 1 million views in just 2 days, sparking widespread discussion about HOA powers and property rights with the hashtag Don't Mess with Texas Farms. Greg Sullivan attempted to conduct an official water resource inspection at my ranch that afternoon, clearly hoping to find violations, but was forced to acknowledge that my creek was a natural water source that didn't require extraction permits for agricultural use on my own property. Sunnyvale Estates organized a protest at my gate the next day, with about 24 residents holding signs reading, "Save our lake" and "Water is life." Local news crews covered the demonstration, but the narrative was shifting. Several comments on Rachel's online story questioned the HOA's claims, with some local residents sharing their own negative experiences with Sunnyvale's aggressive tactics. That night, I received another security alert. Someone had cut through a section of fence and was tampering with the water valve. By the time I reached the area, they had fled, but not before partially damaging my lock. I installed a more sophisticated security system with motion-triggered lights and reinforced locks, filing another police report with Sheriff Thompson and providing the camera footage clearly showing two Sunnyvale maintenance employees acting under Deborah's direct supervision. The constant attacks were taking a toll. After another draining day of legal consultations and documentation, I found myself sitting dejectedly on my porch steps, wondering if the peaceful farm life I dreamed of was just an illusion. The beautiful creek that had drawn me to this property had become the center of a nightmare. Frank Parker's truck pulled up my driveway, the now familiar sight of his battered Ford providing unexpected comfort. He sat beside me without speaking at first, simply handing me a cold beer from the cooler in his truck bed. Nancy and I fought them for 18 months, he finally said, his voice heavy with memory. The construction noise from their so-called emergency drainage work right against our property line went on day and night. Nancy was 5 months pregnant. The stress, the lack of sleep. The doctor said it was a contributing factor when she lost the baby. He took a long drink from his beer, eyes fixed on the horizon. We settled because we couldn't keep fighting. Sometimes I still wonder if I should have held out longer. We sat in silence for several minutes before I spoke. If I give in, they'll just do this to someone else. Frank nodded slowly. That's exactly right, son. These people don't stop unless they're forced to. With renewed determination, I stood up. Then I guess we keep fighting. Sheriff Thompson's investigation into the trespassing incidents was progressing, with formal statements now taken from the Sunnyvale maintenance workers who had admitted Deborah directed them to enter my property without permission. Meanwhile, Deborah implemented a new strategy, spreading rumors within the community that my farming practices were contaminating the water supply. Some residents began to question her leadership after Rachel's reporting, creating divisions within Sunnyvale between those still loyal to Deborah and others concerned about the legal and ethical implications of her tactics. Amanda contacted me again, this time sounding truly disturbed. She had uncovered audio recordings from an HOA executive session where her mother and several board members explicitly discussed moving boundary markers to gradually claim portions of my land. They've been planning this for years, she told me, her voice shaking. When I confronted Mom about it, she just said it was creative community expansion and that I didn't understand what it takes to maintain property values. Amanda had reached a breaking point, torn between family loyalty and professional ethics. After seeing the evidence of workers trespassing on my property and the systematic boundary manipulation, her expression shifted from shock to determination. This has to stop, she said firmly. I'll testify if needed. The injunction hearing was scheduled for Monday morning, and I spent the weekend meticulously organizing my evidence with my attorney. The night before court, around 3 o'clock in the morning, my security cameras captured disturbing footage. 3 individuals in dark clothing pouring something into the creek on my property. A desperate attempt by Deborah to create evidence of contamination she could blame on me. The gavel cracked. Deborah's smug smirk said she'd already won. But in 37 seconds, her daughter would drop a truth bomb that shattered everything. The courthouse was buzzing with unexpected activity for what should have been a routine injunction hearing. Rachel Turner's reporting had turned our dispute into local news, and several Sunnyvale residents attended alongside curious locals. Deborah arrived with a team of 3 attorneys and several board members, all dressed immaculately and projecting confidence. The Sunnyvale legal team opened aggressively, painting me as an environmental vandal endangering a beloved community ecosystem through my reckless and vindictive actions. Their presentation included emotional testimonies from residents about wildlife supposedly threatened by reduced water flow and children disappointed by canceled lake activities. They presented water level measurements suggesting significant decline, carefully avoiding mention that the lake had been artificially maintained by water diverted from my property without permission or compensation. When my turn came, my attorney methodically dismantled their narrative. We presented the official property survey showing the systematic boundary encroachment, historical satellite images demonstrating the gradual movement of the boundary line over years, and documentation proving the water pump had been installed without permission on my land. Frank Parker testified about similar tactics used against other neighboring properties, establishing a pattern of behavior. Several former Sunnyvale residents came forward to describe how Deborah had used HOA resources to pressure holdouts who opposed her initiatives. Throughout our presentation, I noticed the judge's expression shifting from neutral to increasingly concerned, especially when we showed timestamped security footage of Deborah and Greg Sullivan moving boundary stakes under cover of darkness. The Sunnyvale attorneys objected strenuously, claiming the footage was manipulated and that their clients were merely verifying correct boundary placement based on their own surveys. Deborah took the stand with remarkable composure, portraying herself as a dedicated community leader, protecting residents' interests against my selfish actions and agricultural pollution. She claimed the water diversion was based on historical usage rights established long before I purchased the property. When questioned about the boundary stakes, she insisted Sunnyvale's surveys were correct and mine were flawed. We've maintained those boundaries for years without complaint from the previous owner, she stated confidently. Her performance was polished, even convincing, until my attorney presented the official county records and GPS coordinates from the professional survey, definitively proving the encroachment. Mrs. Harrington, are you suggesting the county records and professional GPS mapping are less reliable than your HOA's unregistered survey? The judge asked pointedly. Deborah's composure cracked slightly as she fumbled for a response. Just when we thought the hearing was wrapping up, Sunnyvale's lawyers produced new critical evidence, water test results allegedly showing harmful chemicals present in the creek after it passed through my property. This demonstrates the real reason Mr. Cooper diverted the water, their lead attorney declared dramatically. He is attempting to conceal environmental contamination from his farming activities. I was genuinely shocked by this claim, knowing I hadn't used any chemicals on my property. The judge, seeing my reaction, agreed to a brief recess to allow my team to review this surprise evidence. During the break, Rachel Turner approached my attorney, offering the results from her own independent water testing conducted days earlier that showed no contamination. Something's not adding up, she whispered. Their test results don't match anything I found. The judge agreed to admit Rachel's contradictory test results, ordering further investigation before making a ruling on the injunction. As we prepared to reconvene, an unexpected commotion erupted at the back of the courtroom. Amanda Harrington entered, clutching a tablet and several documents. Your Honor, I have relevant evidence that needs to be presented, she announced, her voice trembling but determined. Deborah's face drained of color as her daughter approached the bench. After a brief sidebar conversation, the judge allowed Amanda to testify. She presented a comprehensive set of documents revealing the golf resort development plan that depended on acquiring my land. More damning was an audio recording from her phone, Deborah's voice clearly instructing someone to make sure those water samples show problematic levels after the lawsuit was filed. They deliberately contaminated the water last night, Amanda testified, unable to look at her mother. I have the recording of the planning call where she directed maintenance staff to pour chemicals into the creek on Mr. Cooper's property specifically to falsify evidence for today's hearing. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as Deborah leapt to her feet. You're betraying your own family, she shouted at Amanda before turning her rage toward me. This is all because of you. The golf resort would have brought millions of dollars in if you hadn't interfered. Her attorneys tried desperately to regain control of the situation, but Deborah continued her meltdown. You have no idea how hard I've worked to build this community. Do you think property values maintain themselves? The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, finally restoring order. Mrs. Harrington, control yourself or I'll have you removed, he warned sternly. Deborah sank back into her chair, visibly shaking with rage. Rachel Turner, who was live tweeting the proceedings, could be heard quietly commenting to another reporter, and this, folks, is how not to run a homeowners association. The judge ordered an immediate investigation into the contamination allegations, suspending the hearing until environmental experts could test the water and analyze both sets of contradictory results. Outside the courthouse, Rachel interviewed shell-shocked Sunnyvale residents who had attended the hearing. "We had no idea about the golf resort plans," one elderly homeowner told her. "We were told the water was for sustaining natural wildlife habitats." Another added, "I've lived in Sunnyvale for 6 years, and never once was there a community vote or even discussion about purchasing adjacent properties for development." An emergency HOA meeting was called that evening, with numerous residents demanding Deborah's immediate resignation. As I returned home, exhausted but hopeful about the case's direction, I found an anonymous text message waiting on my phone. "Your house isn't safe. I won't let you destroy everything I've built." I immediately reported the threatening message to Sheriff Thompson, who increased patrols past my property and advised me to stay with a friend for a couple of nights. Instead, I installed additional security measures, including cameras covering every approach to my house and real-time alerts connected directly to the sheriff's office. The county environmental investigation team arrived early the next morning to collect comprehensive water samples from multiple points along the creek. Their preliminary findings confirmed what we suspected. The contamination was localized to a small section of the creek on my property, with clean water both upstream and downstream, strongly suggesting deliberate tampering rather than agricultural runoff or natural causes. Chemical analysis identified industrial cleaning compounds not used in farming operations. Sheriff Thompson launched a formal criminal investigation into the environmental tampering, obtaining warrants for Sunnyvale maintenance records and communications. The story had grown beyond our local community, with regional news outlets picking up Rachel's reporting about HOA overreach and environmental sabotage. Sunnyvale residents were increasingly divided, with many openly questioning the board's actions and demanding transparency about the golf resort plans that had never been disclosed to the community. Several homeowners approached me privately, apologizing for the HOA's behavior and offering to testify about other instances of boundary disputes and intimidation tactics. The court reconvened 3 days later with the environmental investigation results confirming deliberate contamination. The judge not only denied Sunnyvale's request for an injunction, but issued a temporary restraining order preventing any Sunnyvale representatives from approaching within 100 feet of my property boundary pending criminal investigation outcomes. That evening, my security system alerted me to movement near the creek. The night vision cameras clearly showed Deborah Harrington herself, wearing dark clothing and carrying a large container, moving stealthily toward the water. I immediately called Sheriff Thompson, who dispatched deputies while I monitored her movements through the security feed. They arrived in time to catch her attempting to pour a substantial quantity of industrial chemicals directly into the creek, enough to cause significant environmental damage downstream. "You just poisoned your own legacy," Sheriff Thompson told her as deputies led her away in handcuffs. The charges were serious: attempted environmental contamination, criminal trespassing, and evidence tampering. Combined with the earlier documented boundary tampering and fraudulent evidence, Deborah was facing potential felony charges and significant legal jeopardy. Following Deborah's arrest, the Sunnyvale HOA board underwent a complete overhaul. The subsequent court hearing on my countersuit resulted in a comprehensive judgment. Sunnyvale was ordered to restore the correct property boundaries, pay damages for the unauthorized water usage and boundary manipulation, and formally relinquish all claims to water rights from my creek. The Gulf Resort Development Company withdrew entirely, citing untenable community relations and legal complications. Deborah faced multiple criminal charges for environmental crimes, trespassing, and attempting to falsify evidence. Greg Sullivan resigned from his county position after an internal investigation revealed numerous conflicts of interest and improper use of his authority to favor certain developments, particularly those associated with Deborah Harrington. The new Sunnyvale board, led by the older gentleman who had attempted to suggest compromise during the earlier confrontation, approached me with a proposal for a legitimate water sharing agreement. Amanda, though no longer living in Sunnyvale, helped mediate the negotiations. "We recognize the creek is your water resource," the new HOA president explained during our meeting. "But we'd like to explore a fair arrangement that could benefit both your agricultural needs and our community." I agreed to work with them to design a sustainable water management system that would allow controlled flow to their lake while prioritizing my farm's irrigation requirements during dry periods. Instead of adversaries, we became partners in responsible resource management. During a community meeting where the new agreement was presented, Amanda officially apologized to me on behalf of Sunnyvale. "What happened here isn't just about water or boundaries," she told the assembled residents. "It's about integrity, transparency, and being good neighbors." With my property boundaries secured and water rights protected, I could finally focus on developing my sustainable farm. The previously diverted water now properly irrigated my first crop of organic vegetables, and I installed a proper rainwater collection system to supplement during drier months. Rachel Turner's series on HOA overreach in America won a regional journalism award, bringing greater scrutiny to housing association governance and transparency requirements. Surprisingly, my farm became something of a local educational attraction, with school groups visiting to learn about sustainable water management and agriculture. I developed demonstration areas showing how proper water conservation techniques could benefit both agriculture and natural habitats. Deborah received substantial fines, mandatory community service focused on environmental cleanup, and probation that prohibited her from serving in any HOA or community governance role. Her reputation and influence in the community were permanently damaged. The criminal charges related to environmental contamination resulted in a suspended sentence with strict conditions. One autumn afternoon, about a year after the ordeal began, I stood by my creek watching the clear water flow naturally through my property and then in controlled amounts to the Sunnyvale Lake, which was now thriving with proper management. Frank often stopped by to fish in the creek, joking that water tasted sweeter after victory. A small group of Sunnyvale residents approached along the newly established public walking path that now properly followed the correct boundary line. An elderly woman stepped forward somewhat hesitantly. "We believed the wrong person for too long," she said simply. "Thank you for fighting to protect this water, not just for yourself, but for all of us." The experience had transformed more than just my property. Rachel began receiving inquiries from 5 other communities across the state facing similar HOA disputes, all asking if I might share my experience and advice. My email inbox regularly contained messages from property owners facing boundary disputes or resource appropriation, seeking guidance on standing up to intimidation tactics. The creek still runs clean. Deborah's serving 200 hours community service, scrubbing graffiti at the park she tried to destroy. And that worthless ranch? Last month, I caught Sunnyvale's new president begging to buy my water for triple the price. One evening, as the sun set across my thriving fields, I added a small addition to the sign at my ranch entrance. Below Flowing Truth Sustainable Farm, where country folks don't fear HOAs, I attached a smaller sign reading, "No water theft, no HOA, just truth." The battle had cost me time, money, and the peaceful beginning I'd hoped for. But it had also connected me to a community of neighbors who valued integrity over intimidation. The creek continued its steady flow through my land, a constant reminder that some things are worth fighting for, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who might come after us. If this story made you feel better about your own life choices, our job is done. Give it a like and check out the next BD Stories twist.